Our study of the cerebrum is going to start from the outside and work our way in. Overall, the cerebrum is the largest part of the nervous system. It consists of a large flat sheet of cells, but that flat sheet is too large when laid out to fit in the skull, so it's all folded or crumpled up in order to fit within a smaller space. That cerebrum is wrapped by 3 different meningeal linings that provide protection. It's divided into left and right hemispheres, and then within each hemisphere it's divided into 5 lobes. This image shows 4 of the lobes in different colors. The frontal, which is green, parietal, which is blue, occipital, which is red, and temporal, which is yellow, and the insular, which we can't see from this view. Those lobes are then further divided into gyri and sulci. The gyri are the outfoldings of the sheet of neurons, so the parts that would be most visible from the outside. The sulci are the infoldings, so parts that cannot be seen when looking at the surface of the brain. The meningeal linings consist of 3 different layers that provide protection. The outermost layer is the dura mater. It's a fairly tough lining that's attached to the skull. The arachnoid mater is the middle layer, and it is a bit more of a space than a lining itself. Blood vessels run through the arachnoid mater, and the arachnoid mater is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which provides like a shock absorber for the brain. The innermost layer of the meningeal linings is the pia mater. It's something kind of like fascia that closely follows the contours of the brain, so it goes in with all of the different sulci and sticks out with all the different gyri on the surface of the cortex. So the meningeal linings provide protection to the brain. They help hold the brain in place during movement and keep it from bouncing off the skull, basically. They also provide support for different brain structures and the vascular system, bringing of nutrients to and taking away waste products from the brain. The meningeal linings do extend down into the spinal cord in basically the same way. The meningeal linings do surround the entire central nervous system structures. There are some infoldings of the dura mater that physically divide the brain up into different regions. The falx cerebri separates the 2 hemispheres of the cerebrum, the right and left hemisphere. There's also a falx cerebelli for 2 hemispheres of the cerebellum that we'll talk about when we talk about the subcortex and hindbrain. The tentorium cerebelli separates the cortex from the cerebellum at the posterior part of the brain. And the diaphragma sella helps separate a couple of minor brain structures at the front part of the brain, basically along the visual tract. Cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the central nervous system, provides a cushion for the neural tissue. It also helps in delivering nutrients and taking away waste. Cerebrospinal fluid flows through 4 different ventricles in the brain and around the arachnoid mater, around the surface of the brain. Central cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus within each of these 4 ventricles. The 4 ventricles are the lateral ventricles. There are 2, one on each side, that are basically underneath the infoldings of the cortex. There's a 3rd ventricle that's kind of right in the center of the brain, near the thalami, the 2 thalamuses, if you make an English plural out of it. And then the 4th ventricle is down near the cerebellum and the brainstem. The cerebrum itself consists of cortex. You may have heard the term gray matter when talking about the brain. That is the outer surface of the brain. It's relatively thin, between 2 and 4 millimeters thick, and has 6 different cell layers in it. The cortex is divided into 2 halves. the two hemispheres, left and right hemispheres. The hemispheres are connected to each other by a structure called the corpus callosum. That is a white matter structure, and transmission lines from the cortex to other structures in the brain and down to the spinal cord are all through white matter connections. The cerebrum is further divided into 5 lobes that will be talked about in a different video. There are some landmarks that help divide up the cerebrum into its various pieces. The cerebral longitudinal fissure is a very deep sulcus that separates the right and left hemispheres from each other. There are a variety of gyri around the brain, and for each of the lobes we'll talk about a couple of important ones for speech and language functions. When looking at the brain from the outside, the sulci are those valleys or gaps, but remember that those valleys do contain gray matter. There are infoldings of the cortex. There is gray matter down there that does things. It is just because the brain isn't laid out flat, that texture in it doesn't really represent a gap, it just represents a folding. I mentioned the cerebral longitudinal fissure, and generally speaking the term fissure is used for some of the bigger sulci. Fissures and sulci basically are interchangeable terms. This image that we saw before has a lot of different labeled gyri and sulci on it, including some of the main fissures. You'll get fairly familiar with this view of the brain. This particular view of the brain is looking at the left hemisphere, looking at the brain from the side. Anterior would be toward the left of the image, posterior would be toward the right of the image, superior is up and inferior is down. The cerebrum is divided into 5 lobes, both anatomically in terms of structural divisions as well as functionally in terms of what those lobes do. 4 of the lobes mirror anatomy of the skull, which we will talk about later in this class. So there are frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal skull bones that are on top of the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes of the brain. The insular lobe is a deep infolding of the brain that's bounded by a sulcus called the circular sulcus. The visible outer lobes of the cerebrum are shown here, again in the same colors, but with some slightly different information about functions that take place in each of these brain areas generally. So pausing for a minute and taking a look at some of the things on this slide might be a useful overview for you. The insular lobe is visible as indicated by this illustration here if you were able to pull parts of the brain apart and look underneath. So the insular lobe is deep to the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. It can be found beneath the lateral sulcus. Most of the functions for the insular lobe have to do with more basic body functions and with emotional responses. Sometimes the insular lobe is referred to as part of the limbic system, which handles more primitive, you might say, bodily functions and emotional responses. Underneath the cortex, there are a variety of subcortex structures. We're going to talk about 3 in more detail when we talk about the subcortex in the hindbrain: the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the thalamus. These are located between the cortex and other structures like the cerebellum and the brainstem. Physical divisions of the cortex in terms of major sulci and fissures. There's the cerebral longitudinal fissure, which separates the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. This particular image, we're looking down on the brain from above, so it's a superior view. Again, anterior is to the left, posterior is to the right. Cerebral longitudinal fissure runs right down the middle from left to right, separating the left and right hemispheres from each other. Looking at the brain from the side, so again, anterior to the left, posterior to the right, we have the lateral sulcus, which separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and from part of the parietal lobe, the more anterior part of the parietal lobe. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and again, provides an anatomical division which was reflected, say, in earlier images in those different colors. The brain structure certainly looks the same if you look at an actual brain, but this structural division with a deep sulcus between the two hemispheres also matches functional divisions between what different parts of the brain process. The cerebrum is composed of 6 different layers of cells. These different layers have various functions in terms of input and output of information, as well as support functions, bringing nutrients in and helping waste products be removed. We aren't really going to focus a lot on the different layers of the cerebrum, but just to give you an idea of the complexity of the structure here. Different parts of the cerebrum are going to have cells in different layers in different quantities. So parts involved in motor control, for example, are going to have a lot more cells that send outputs out. Sensory areas are going to have a lot more cells that bring inputs in. But generally speaking, throughout the cerebrum, we find all types of cells. They're just in different quantities in different locations. Nutrients are brought to the brain by the cerebrovascular system. This is pretty important in the field of speech-language pathology because a certain number of acute neurological problems come from problems with blood supply to the brain, either a blockage of the blood supply or one of these vessels bursting and blood getting into the brain and causing damage to the nerve cells. The cerebrovascular system is supplied from both carotid and vertebral arteries that come up from the heart, come up from the torso. These blood supplies come in and mix together at an area called the Circle of Willis, where even though there are distinct inputs of blood flow into the brain area, they all then can be mixed together and output to different regions in the brain. Presumably this is kind of a good design feature for the brain. If there happens to be a blockage in, say, one of the carotid arteries, blood from the other carotid artery and from the vertebral arteries can still flow and feed the entire brain by way of the Circle of Willis. Blood supply from the Circle of Willis to the rest of the cortex takes place from 3 different cerebral arteries. The anterior and posterior cerebral arteries are shown in the bottom right image, and they provide blood flow to the medial part of the brain, so the part that's down inside the cerebral longitudinal fissure. The middle cerebral artery provides blood supply to pretty much all of the brain that you can see when you look at the brain. So that's in the upper image there, where we have our kind of standard view of the brain from the side, again anterior to the front, posterior to the back, and all the different lobes there, frontal, parietal, temporal, even occipital, are primarily supplied by that middle cerebral artery.